the Islamic expansion into the Iberian Peninsula followed a pattern already seen in the Eastern Mediterranean. A relatively small but determined force advanced into lands where political authority had collapsed, and local populations felt abandoned by their rulers. After the Visigothic army was decisively defeated near what is now southern Spain in the early 8th century, the peninsula was left largely undefended. From that point onward, Muslim forces moved steadily across the land, town by town, facing little coordinated resistance. Each settlement was confronted with a clear choice. Communities could attempt to resist and face destruction, or they could surrender and negotiate their survival. Those who chose surrender were allowed to remain on their land under a system of protection. In return for a fixed tax and political submission, they were granted security, religious freedom, and a large degree of local autonomy. This arrangement emerged during the early Islamic conquests and became a standard way of integrating conquered populations without mass displacement or forced conversion. Across most of the frontier regions, surrender was the common decision. Only a handful of places attempted prolonged resistance, and even these eventually accepted negotiated terms. Later stories of heroic local uprisings appear to be products of much later imagination rather than historical reality. In the centuries that followed, newcomers from North Africa and the Eastern Islamic world did arrive in the peninsula, but they never formed a large majority. Most of the original conquerors settled permanently, yet their numbers were limited. One final major wave of newcomers arrived from the Eastern Mediterranean in the mid-8th century, after which large-scale migration largely ended. Later arrivals from North Africa continued at a slower pace, particularly as rulers sought soldiers who could balance the power of local elites. Despite these movements, the majority of the population remained descended from the people who had lived in the region before the conquest. This was especially true in the northern frontier zones, where Muslim settlers lived among overwhelmingly local communities. Contemporary observers noted that settlement in these frontier areas was sparse, with few new towns being founded. Even major cities that did receive Muslim elites often came under the control of families whose roots lay in the Roman and Visigothic past, showing how deeply local society remained embedded. Over time, power in the region shifted gradually. At first, leadership was dominated by families of local origin who adapted to the new political order. Only after several generations did families of clear Arab descent rise to prominence. The scale of Berber settlement has long been debated, but archaeological and place name evidence suggests stronger concentrations in certain valleys and plains south of the main river systems, with smaller communities scattered throughout the frontier zone. Although immigration was uneven, settlement patterns did change. Major cities that had been important for centuries continued to anchor the region, while some abandoned towns were rebuilt and brought back to life. At the same time, other urban centres declined further and were eventually deserted, often because their locations made them vulnerable in a militarised frontier landscape. In contrast, settlements positioned along defensible routes or fertile valleys grew in importance and prosperity. Geography played a decisive role. Places with access to water, farmland, forests, trade routes and defensible terrain tended to survive and even flourish. Coastal access and river connections encouraged continuity, while exposed sites slowly faded away. New towns also emerged under Islamic rule, especially in areas well suited to North African farming and herding traditions. Yet the most important transformation was not simply where people lived, but how rural society was organised. Gradually, a new pattern developed that linked small villages to fortified centres, reshaping daily life, agriculture and local authority. This transformation did not occur overnight. It evolved slowly alongside the spread of Arabic language, Islamic customs and new political structures. Rather than being imposed by force, it grew organically out of changing social and economic realities. In this quiet but profound shift, the landscape of the frontier was reshaped more deeply than by conquest alone. The depth of Christianity in the Ebro region before the arrival of Islam is far from clear. On the surface, Visigothic Spain appeared firmly Christian, with an active church hierarchy and frequent religious gatherings held in major towns of the region. Urban centres such as Zaragoza clearly supported a well-developed Christian elite, capable of producing influential religious figures and sustaining an educated clerical culture tied into wider Iberian networks. Beyond the cities, however, the picture changes dramatically. In the countryside, Christianity was shallow and uneven. Local elites controlled small private churches attached to their estates, institutions that did little to shape the daily religious life of the peasantry. Rural belief systems were fragmented, blending loosely Christian elements with older ritual practices focused on magic, protection, and custom rather than doctrine. Faith in these areas was less a structured religion than a collection of inherited habits. This limited penetration became visible soon after the Islamic conquest. Early Muslim authorities recorded cases where Christians followed food customs common to Jews and Muslims, suggesting a population whose religious boundaries were fluid rather than firmly defined. Unlike the south of the peninsula, the frontier regions lacked strong monastic networks rooted in family tradition. As a result, there was no organised Christian infrastructure capable of mounting sustained resistance to the spread of Islamic culture. Islam was not forced upon the population. Since the inhabitants were recognised as Christians, coercive conversion was avoided. Change instead unfolded gradually. Conversion began among administrators and local power holders, sometimes encouraged by influential Muslim families, and sometimes driven by ambitious native clans seeking advantage within the new order. New Muslims aligned themselves with established elites, adopting their social identity and sharing in their prestige. Over time, this process strengthened Muslim networks, while quietly dissolving older Christian structures. Because rural churches were tied to noble estates, the conversion of landholding families often meant the collapse of Christianity in entire districts. Once elites shifted allegiance, villagers tended to follow. Slaves and lower status individuals also converted early, drawn by the social mobility and protection that Islam seemed to offer in a rapidly changing world. Historians still debate how quickly this transformation occurred. Some argue for a slow process stretching over generations, while others see a rapid shift within the first century of Muslim rule. What matters most, however, is the end result. By the middle of the 11th century, the frontier society had become overwhelmingly Muslim, even if small Christian communities survived on the margins. These Christian remnants did not disappear entirely. Traces of church organisation persisted in some towns, and rural churches continued to function in scattered locations. Christians even took part in frontier warfare, fighting alongside Muslim forces against northern enemies and during internal conflicts. At times, their loyalty proved fatal, as when Christian fighters perished defending rebel strongholds against central authority. Some villages may have remained largely Christian, but surviving records are too thin to confirm this with certainty. We catch only indirect glimpses of this community through scattered correspondence, travel accounts, and faint echoes of religious dissent. Unlike the South, the frontier never witnessed large-scale Christian resistance movements or prolonged rebellions by converted elites. Instead, Christianity seems to have faded quietly, its institutions dissolving rather than collapsing in open conflict. By the later period, evidence for surviving Christians comes mostly from documents produced after the Christian reconquest of the region. These records hint at communities that had endured under Muslim rule, sometimes concentrated in specific urban quarters. Larger towns appear to have maintained enough cohesion to preserve Christian worship and leadership, even as their members adapted to the dominant culture around them. Christians were not excluded from public life. Some held administrative posts and served Muslim rulers as diplomats or officials. Over time, they adopted the language, dress, and naming customs of Islamic society so thoroughly that their identity became culturally hybrid. Arabic-style names appeared in Christian documents, not as disguises, but as genuine expressions of acculturation. At the same time, local names entered Muslim usage, translated or adapted into Arabic forms, showing that cultural exchange flowed in both directions. By the 12th century, these Christians had developed traditions that set them apart from the rest of Latin Europe. Their religious practice, legal customs, and language bore deep marks of the Islamic world. Even when Christian kings reclaimed the region, these communities were not always recognized as distinct groups. Over successive generations, they were absorbed into the wider Christian population and vanished as a separate identity. Alongside Christians, Jewish communities flourished throughout the frontier, as they did across much of Muslim Iberia. Some cities became known for their Jewish populations, which were vibrant enough to attract converts from abroad. Intellectual life thrived under the patronage of Muslim rulers, and refugees from violence elsewhere in the peninsula found shelter in the Ebro region. Jews, like Christians, served in government and courtly roles, and some rose to great prominence before eventually converting to Islam. Jewish culture in the region was deeply shaped by Arabic language and thought. This influence was so strong that it remained visible long after Muslim rule had ended. The frontier society that emerged was therefore not simply Islamic, Christian, or Jewish, but a layered civilization shaped by centuries of coexistence, adaptation, and cultural blending. Tracing how culture changed in the Ebro Valley after the arrival of Islam is not straightforward. Religious conversion rarely followed a clear or uniform path, and in this frontier region the process was especially complex. Daily life unfolded in close contact with neighbouring Christian territories, which naturally encouraged overlap in customs, habits, and beliefs. In this sense, the Ebro frontier was not exceptional. Across much of the Islamic world, Muslim societies developed alongside Christian communities, sharing borders, markets, and seasonal rhythms. Because of this, reports that describe Andalusi Muslims as heavy drinkers or culturally relaxed should not be misunderstood as signs of weak faith or religious failure. Similar behaviours appeared in many frontier regions of the medieval Islamic world. The limited use of Christian calendars or the celebration of certain local festivals was not unique to Iberia either. Throughout Islamic lands, the lunar calendar was often supplemented by solar systems better suited to agriculture and navigation. Cultural blending was common, even when religious scholars disapproved of it, and rulers themselves sometimes tolerated or encouraged shared customs. In the earliest decades of Muslim rule in Iberia, interaction between communities was intense. Cemeteries and places of worship were sometimes shared. Coins circulated in more than one language, and material culture continued along late Roman lines. Unlike other regions of Islamic expansion, Muslim settlers in Iberia did not isolate themselves in newly founded military towns. Instead, they settled directly within existing cities and villages, becoming part of the social fabric almost immediately. Economic policy reinforced this closeness. The ruling elite was encouraged to farm and manage land rather than remain separated as a purely military class. Everyday cooperation in agriculture, trade, marriage, and neighbourhood life created an environment in which cultural exchange became unavoidable. Over time, these conditions made Islam increasingly familiar and attractive to local populations, even without pressure or force. Religious blending affected Muslims as well. In medieval societies, strict religious doctrine was most firmly upheld in cities, while rural areas often followed looser interpretations shaped by tradition and necessity. Frontier zones across history show similar patterns. In later centuries, comparable regions witnessed communities that mixed religious practices freely, reading sacred texts from more than one tradition and maintaining older customs alongside newer beliefs. On the Iberian frontier, conversion was rarely a sudden spiritual break. It was part of a broader shift in language, family structure, social behaviour and political loyalty. Understanding conversion therefore requires viewing it as a long process of cultural transformation rather than a single religious decision. Language, household customs, legal habits, and social identity mattered just as much as belief. These elements gradually reshaped society and prepared the ground for deeper religious change. Language played a central role in this transformation. Arabic held a unique position within Islam as the language of revelation, giving it a prestige unmatched by sacred languages in Christianity. As Islam spread, Arabic often replaced local languages entirely. In Iberia, this process unfolded with remarkable speed. Despite their limited numbers, Muslim settlers exercised strong cultural influence, and Arabic became the shared language of administration, learning, and everyday life. By the 9th century, even Christian writers complained that Latin was disappearing from common use. Later observers described a society in which Muslims and Christians alike spoke Arabic. This dominance extended even to frontier regions, where there is no evidence of large communities unable to use the language. Arabic culture carried such prestige that neighbouring Christian rulers adopted Arabic forms in their own documents. Language alone does not automatically indicate cultural loyalty, and history offers many examples of ruling elites who governed in languages they barely spoke. Yet in the Ebro region, the depth of Arabic penetration is clear from its survival long after Muslim political power had faded. Documents written in Arabic continued to circulate for centuries, dealing with ordinary land transactions among non-elite individuals. The language remained in use well into the later medieval period, leaving little doubt that Arabic had been the everyday tongue of the region for generations. Alongside Arabic speakers came Berbers from North Africa, bringing their own traditions and languages. These migrants maintained close ties with their homelands, moving back and forth across the sea and sustaining extended family networks. Migration was steady rather than dramatic, involving not only soldiers but also farmers and craftsmen. Over time, this created a diverse Berber presence across Iberia. The political visibility of Berbers varied by region. In the south, some established ruling dynasties, while in the Ebro frontier they rarely held top political power. This does not imply weak settlement. Early waves favoured frontier lands, while later arrivals concentrated elsewhere. In the north, Berbers appear mainly as productive settlers rather than political leaders, a group largely ignored by chroniclers who focused on courts and wars rather than everyday life. Because neither Muslim nor Christian writers paid much attention to ordinary settlers, much of this history remains silent. What is clear, however, is that migration from North Africa and southern Iberia continued even after Christian forces took control of the region. These later movements likely helped preserve elements of Berber culture long after the frontier itself had changed hands. Using place names to track where North African settlers lived can be useful, but it is never straightforward. Some locations carry clear clues, such as names that echo clan identities, tribal labels, or even references tied to market routines and weekly gathering days. These markers can suggest that groups from North Africa once settled nearby. Yet this method has a major weakness. Arabic or Berber-sounding names sometimes appear in places that existed long before Muslim rule, or in sites that never had meaningful settlement at all. So while place names can point us in a direction, they cannot be treated as proof on their own. In the Ebro lands, names that hint at North African roots do appear, but they are not overwhelming. A few names preserve recognisably Berber sounds and survive in multiple locations, and certain valleys show clusters of clan-style naming patterns. There are also traces that resemble North African tribal origins, in areas closer to key river routes and older urban centres, but overall the map does not scream mass replacement. Instead, it suggests pockets of settlement woven into a much larger local landscape. Even with all the debate, one point is difficult to escape. North African settlement in the northern frontier was real, and, in some districts, substantial. Strong concentrations seem to have existed in the southeastern uplands, and in zones stretching toward the Ebro corridor. It is likely these settlers arrived early, alongside the first waves of conquest, and then continued to be reinforced slowly over time. As for language, a common assumption is that these groups would have spoken their own tongue in addition to Arabic. Yet clear evidence of isolated communities speaking only Berber is missing. In practice, frontier life pushed people towards shared communication. Settlements were not sealed off from neighbours, and many were integrated into wider trade and farming networks. Over generations, the original language of newcomers may have faded as a blended regional identity took shape, especially since Berber speech was largely informal and rarely recorded in official writing. If we try to imagine daily life in the frontier, the most realistic picture is a multilingual world. People moved between languages depending on context. Arabic was dominant in administration and public life, but local Romance speech persisted, and Christian Latin traditions remained present in religious settings. Jewish communities added Hebrew and other learned traditions into the mix. This kind of linguistic flexibility rarely appears in official chronicles, because writers often ignored what ordinary people spoke. So we rely on scattered clues. Some of those clues are striking. Accounts of warfare describe moments where a fighter could blend into an enemy camp because he spoke the other side's language well enough to pass unnoticed. Even far from the frontier, in regions more thoroughly shaped by Arabic culture, Romance speech still survived among rural Muslims. This tells us that bilingual or mixed language life was not a rare exception. It was part of the texture of society. What is equally important is the apparent lack of obsession with policing language in the northern frontier. Scholars and officials from the region did not consistently treat local heritage as shameful, and records preserve figures whose names clearly reflect Latin or Romance backgrounds without any attempt to hide them. Some individuals even produced literary expressions that drew directly from Romance speech. That openness may help explain why outsiders sometimes describe the peninsula as culturally distant from older Arab homelands, even though many other observers saw it as fully within the Islamic cultural world. Along the frontier itself, many Christian leaders and warriors who lived between two worlds almost certainly had working Arabic, while some Muslims had enough Romance to negotiate trade or serve as intermediaries. Captivity, ransom deals, market trade, and border diplomacy created constant opportunities for communication. Even farmers and village traders, the kinds of people chroniclers rarely describe, had reasons to speak across the frontier. Language is only one layer. Family life and social structure are another, and here the evidence becomes even harder to interpret. Some historians argue that immigrant communities brought strong clan-based family systems with them, shaped around male lineage, tight internal marriage patterns, and extended kin groups acting together as a unit. Others believe that frontier society leaned more toward the family patterns common in Christian Europe, centered on household units rather than large lineage blocks. The truth likely varied from place to place and from class to class. Elite immigrant families clearly maintained strong kin networks, and some local converts adopted the outward form of these systems as they entered Muslim political and religious circles. Early on, we see local families reshaping their public identity to fit new patterns of belonging, signalling a desire to join the ruling culture rather than resist it. Similar naming habits and kin-based identity continue to appear even centuries later, showing how long these models could survive. At the same time, we should be careful not to reduce every conflict or political struggle to tribal identity. Chroniclers often use the language of tribal rivalry because it sounded familiar and dramatic, but the real causes of civil wars and power struggles were usually local and practical. Still, many alliances did form along kin lines, and the repeated appearance of cousin groups acting together suggests that family networks mattered in politics, even when identity itself was not the root cause. When we look below the elite level, certainty fades. Most surviving documents come from the period after Christian conquest, and they were often written for legal dealings with Christian authorities. That context reshapes what we see. Traditional Arabic naming patterns, which could signal clan affiliation in an Islamic setting, may not appear clearly in Latin records, even if they still mattered in everyday Muslim society. Yet hints remain. Some Arabic language documents preserve more complex naming forms than Latin ones do, suggesting that the disappearance of these markers in Christian records does not necessarily mean the family structures vanished. In many cases, what once functioned as a flexible identity label could later harden into a fixed surname, especially under Christian administration, where names needed to behave like stable legal identifiers. Other clues come from land ownership and family transactions. We find groups selling property together, sometimes including parents, children and married couples, and occasionally including wider circles of relatives. But extended family paperwork does not automatically prove a clan-based system. It could reflect practicality, shared inheritance, or joint labour rather than a formal lineage hierarchy. In some cases, a senior man appears to represent a wider group of kin, but whether he acted as a clan leader in the older sense or simply as the head of a household is difficult to establish. Shared land ownership might seem like a useful way to detect clan-based social structures, yet the evidence from the Ebro region does not support this idea. Unlike later periods, when records clearly describe communal lands divided among conquerors, the surviving documents from the Islamic era of the Ebro show no trace of village-wide property. Land appears consistently as the possession of individuals or small family units, usually parents and children or close siblings. Occasionally, elders were asked to clarify village boundaries, but this does not point to collective ownership. Such situations arose from unclear pasture zones or marginal lands, and similar testimony was also given by Christian elders. This tells us more about local administration than about family structure. Outside religious buildings and charitable endowments, property transactions consistently involve clearly defined owners rather than clans. One of the key features expected in a tribal system, shared ownership by extended kin groups, is therefore absent. This absence does not necessarily mean that clan-based families did not exist. The documents that survive were created for legal and economic purposes, and they rarely capture the full texture of social life. Family structures may have been flexible, appearing only when relevant, rather than shaping every interaction. Economic dealings were often handled by individuals or couples without reference to wider kin networks, a pattern that can be observed in both Muslim and Christian rural societies. This does not rule out the presence of extended families operating behind the scenes. If tightly knit clan systems had been limited mainly to the upper social ranks, then their influence would have weakened after conquest and migration removed much of that elite. What remained would have been a more diffuse version of those models, adapted to new conditions rather than rigidly preserved. Another window into social organisation comes from the position of women. Some figures from the frontier appear outspoken and politically active, which has led to suggestions that gender roles followed European rather than Islamic norms. Yet this interpretation does not hold up. Islamic societies have long included women who exercise political influence, economic independence and strong personal authority. Female agency does not contradict Islamic social frameworks. Economic activity by women in the Ebro frontier fits comfortably within Islamic norms. Legal sources from across the Islamic world recognize women's right to own property, manage wealth, and conduct business independently. Occasional disciplinary cases also show that rules governing modesty and gender interaction applied broadly, not only to elite women. Manuals dealing with public order and moral conduct assume that these standards were part of everyday life across society. Later records from the Christian period offer additional insight. Many Muslim women appear as independent landowners and entrepreneurs. They are frequently married rather than widowed, and they conduct transactions with religious institutions, trade land, receive vineyards, and manage property with little interference. In some cases, women defended their financial rights even against their own husbands, taking disputes to court and asserting control over their personal wealth. These actions align closely with Islamic legal principles, which preserve a woman's ownership of property before and during marriage. All of this strengthens the view that Islamic personal law had taken firm root in the region. Religious practice in Islam is inseparable from legal norms, especially in areas such as inheritance, marriage, divorce, and gender relations. These rules carried with them cultural patterns shaped far beyond Iberia, yet they were fully active on the northern frontier. Even though these legal traditions originated in a different time and place, they became part of everyday life in the Ebro lands. The difficulty of seeing Arab and Berber social models clearly in the sources does not mean they were absent. Rather, it reflects the limits of the surviving evidence. Family systems based on male lineage and extended kinship could coexist with other forms of organisation, adapting to local realities. These models did not require a strong sense of ethnic identity to function, and over time distinctions between Arab, Berber and local converts likely faded. Indeed, later Christian writers did not consistently distinguish between different Muslim groups. Labels varied widely and were often used interchangeably, reflecting religion rather than origin. Over time, administrative language simplified further, using a single term to describe Muslims as a whole. As written records increasingly shifted into local vernaculars, new words replaced older ones, signalling not ethnic difference but political and religious identity. The influence of North African social traditions on life in the Ebro frontier was shaped by the deep transformations these communities experienced after crossing into Iberia. Groups whose way of life had long included seasonal movement and pastoral mobility were suddenly settled in a land where true nomadism no longer existed. This transition was not easy. Certain settlement forms common in North Africa, especially fortified rural compounds tied to semi-nomadic life, did not survive the move. As a result, some social arrangements linked to those environments may also have faded. Yet social structures do not vanish simply because landscapes change. Ways of organising family, authority and belonging can persist, even when living conditions are altered. In the Ebro region, it is entirely possible that different systems coexisted. Older local family traditions may have continued in rural settings, while newcomers and upwardly mobile groups adopted more formal Islamic patterns as they entered urban life or religious circles. Frontier society was fluid, and movement between town and countryside was constant. People changed status, occupation and identity with relative ease. As attention shifts toward religious learning, administration and economic life, the Islamic character of the region becomes increasingly clear. Whatever uncertainties remain about family organisation are overshadowed by the strength of Islamic institutions and cultural life. Religious learning in Muslim Iberia tended towards stability rather than experimentation. Over time, one legal tradition became dominant, providing a shared framework for belief and practice. This consistency helped bind together a society made up of diverse origins and experiences. The Ebro frontier, despite its location, was not culturally isolated. Contacts with Christians and Jews may have encouraged everyday blending, but they also produced a strong current of renewal within Islam itself. From an early stage, religious scholars were active in the region, maintaining close ties with the wider Islamic world. Travel between Iberia and the great centres of learning never ceased. Scholars from the frontier journeyed east to deepen their knowledge, while visitors from distant lands passed through frontier cities, sometimes remarking on their lively intellectual atmosphere. These exchanges ensured that local religious life remained connected, informed, and resilient. The movement of scholars across regions helped unify religious practice. Judges and teachers often served in multiple towns during their careers, carrying ideas and legal norms with them. Political borders mattered little in this world of learning. When turmoil struck the heartlands further south, the frontier absorbed refugees, strengthening its cultural life rather than weakening it. Courts in the region became centres of learning, attracting thinkers whose influence extended far beyond local politics. The number of religious scholars active in the Ebro lands compares favourably with other major regions of the peninsula. More important than sheer numbers, however, is their distribution. Islamic learning was not confined to large cities. Smaller towns and even villages produced teachers and students, and local schools ensured that religious knowledge reached deep into the countryside. Contemporary descriptions speak of towns filled with places of prayer and of scholars trained close to home rather than imported from afar. This spread of learning shows that Islam was not the preserve of an urban elite or a foreign minority. Knowledge flowed outward from cities to villages and back again, preserving shared norms while allowing local expression. If theology and language were taught outside cities, then social customs shaped by Islam were likely just as widespread. Popular religious devotion also left its mark. Along the frontier, believers established places where individuals could dedicate themselves temporarily to spiritual struggle and defense of the land. Many of these were private initiatives rather than state projects, revealing a strong sense of personal religious responsibility. Religious teachers emphasized that merely living on the frontier was not enough. Active participation was expected, and many scholars themselves joined in fighting, some losing their lives. Equally telling is what sources do not say. Travellers and writers from other parts of the Islamic world were quick to note unusual or improper practices when they encountered them elsewhere. In their descriptions of Iberia and the frontier, such complaints are largely absent. Later observers from the region moved comfortably through the Eastern Islamic world, showing no sign of cultural dislocation. Legal manuals produced after the fall of the frontier display strict adherence to accepted religious practice, confirming continuity rather than decline. Many scholars who fled northward during later conquests carried this tradition with them, helping to spark renewed religious life in new homes. Their influence testifies to the vitality of Islam in the Ebro region before its fall. The social origins of these scholars were remarkably broad. Unlike the rigid clerical hierarchies of medieval Christian Europe, Islamic society placed learning within reach of all believers. There was no formal priesthood and no central institution controlling doctrine. Authority rested on reputation and consensus rather than office. Anyone who mastered religious knowledge and earned respect could teach and judge. Because of this openness, scholars came from many walks of life. Traders, craftsmen, farmers, and even former slaves could rise to prominence. Social boundaries were loose, and class divisions lacked the legal weight found elsewhere. Identity was shaped not only by wealth or birth, but by learning, piety, and personal networks. In this world, working, worshipping, and fighting were not separate callings but shared responsibilities. Religious scholars were often deeply embedded in everyday economic life. Many continued their trades, balancing commercial activity with legal and spiritual authority. This connection grounded religious interpretation in local realities and restrained authoritarian impulses from rulers. The intellectual life of the region reflected this diversity. Scholars often pursued multiple disciplines, moving easily between law, medicine, science, and literature. Poetry in particular revealed the depth of cultural integration. New poetic forms emerged that blended languages and traditions, openly drawing on local speech and rhythms. These works testify to widespread multilingualism and cultural confidence. At the same time, movements arose that challenged the idea of cultural hierarchy within Islam. Voices from the peninsula pushed back against the dominance of Arabic identity, insisting that local traditions had value of their own. The strength of this reaction shows both the success of Islamic civilization and the persistence of older cultural currents beneath its surface. In the Ebro frontier, Islamic society was neither a fragile imitation nor a rigid transplant. It was a living system shaped by movement, learning, and adaptation. What emerged was a deeply Islamic culture confident enough to absorb diversity and strong enough to endure long after political power had shifted. At first glance, the culture of the northern frontier seems contradictory. It could appear deeply committed to mainstream Islamic practice, yet shaped by local habits inherited from the Christian past. That tension was not just religious or cultural. It was built into how power and money worked, how towns governed themselves, and how people responded to crisis. For centuries after the initial conquest, the frontier was officially tied to the great southern capital. In theory, it was part of a single political world. In practice, the region developed an independent temperament almost from the beginning. Major cities in the north repeatedly challenged distant authority, and the frontier's daily realities made tight control difficult. Distance, constant warfare, and the need for rapid local decisions pushed the region toward autonomy. This frontier status shaped government. In the calmer interior provinces, the centre often prevented local rulers from building deep power bases by rotating administrators frequently. The frontier could not function like that. Military pressure required stability, long service, and local experience. So frontier districts were often left under long-term military leadership. Over time, this created powerful regional dynasties and entrenched ruling families who treated authority as hereditary, even while still speaking the language of loyalty to the southern capital. This pattern extended beyond the main city. Important sub-districts developed their own governors, each with a tight relationship to local elites and local armed forces. By the time the great southern state fell apart, the frontier was already used to governing itself. Where other parts of the peninsula descended into chaotic competition among rival factions, the northern frontier moved through the crisis with far less disruption. Local rulers remained in place, provincial commanders gained confidence, and independence was declared not as a dramatic revolution, but as an almost natural continuation of what had already been happening for generations. In many regions, the collapse of central authority created a vacuum. In the frontier, it created a moment of consolidation. After a period of shifting alliances, one dominant house united much of the region. From the mid-11th century onward, a single dynasty controlled a wide stretch of the frontier, holding key cities and fortresses while struggling with internal rivalries and a steady loss of ground to advancing Christian powers. Understanding how government worked inside the frontier is difficult. The chroniclers who wrote about the age were fascinated by rulers, coups, and wars. They rarely described the everyday machinery of local life. They wrote about cities far more than villages, leaving rural administration largely in shadow. Even so, the broad outline is visible. Power was imagined as personal. Authority flowed downward from the ruler, and local leaders often presented themselves not as kings, but as officials acting under higher legitimacy. Judges were chosen from the learned religious class, and public order was maintained through officials responsible for markets, morality, and policing. Prayer leaders and other religious functionaries were supported through public funds. There was no single fixed blueprint that every town followed. Each place developed its own arrangement depending on size, wealth, and local politics. In this world, law and religion were tightly fused. Courts and legal hearings often took place near the main mosque, and legal authority was closely tied to religious reputation. A respected scholar could influence decisions even without holding an official post. This made justice difficult to privatize in the way it often was in feudal Europe, where law could become an instrument of local lords. Still, rulers did develop special courts to handle grievances and political disputes, especially when ordinary legal procedure could not resolve a crisis. Taxation also carried a religious framework, at least in theory. Certain contributions were understood as obligations that fed the public treasury. In practice, rulers frequently demanded extra payments beyond the ideal model. Even so, the frontier seems to have been treated differently in many cases. Because it was seen as a shield zone, defending the border, its inhabitants sometimes received lighter burdens than those living deeper inside the state. The relationship between town and countryside also shaped frontier life. Islamic society is often described as city-centred, and towns certainly mattered. The central mosque, markets, baths, cemeteries, and charitable foundations created strong urban hubs, and many towns were heavily fortified. Yet this should not blind us to the countryside. Farming and irrigation were not separate from urban life. Rural production fed the towns. Towns organised markets for rural goods, and people moved constantly between both worlds. Archaeology has revealed how the frontier countryside was structured. Rather than a landscape dominated solely by great castles owned by lords, many rural districts were built around fortified points linked to clusters of villages. These fortifications were not always part of a grand state-designed defensive line. Many appear to have grown organically, shaped by local needs, local rivalries, and the constant threat of raids. Communities built and maintained protective structures to shelter people and livestock in moments of danger. In many cases, these works were funded by local contributions, suggesting collective responsibility rather than purely lordly command. This rural model contrasts sharply with the way Christian frontier society often developed, where a castle could function as the centre of both military control and lordly domination over surrounding villages. In the Islamic frontier, supplying local defensive points could be treated as a communal obligation, more like a public duty than a private tax demanded for a lord's benefit. Alongside village clusters, the countryside also contained large estates owned by elites, worked by tenants, and hired labour. Yet even these estates often depended heavily on free peasant communities, rather than a rigid system of dependent rural servitude. The most productive farming sector in many frontier zones was likely intensive irrigation agriculture, based on small plots held by free cultivators, grouped around villages and supported by carefully managed water systems. When the Christian advance began to press deeper into these lands, early conquest documents reveal something crucial about frontier politics. Negotiation mattered. Leaders could not always surrender or act alone. Agreements were often made through groups, councils, and respected local figures. Even garrisons sometimes refused the decisions of their commanders. These episodes point to a society where authority depended heavily on consent and collective agreement. This pattern appears earlier as well. In several recorded moments, communities are described as choosing leaders, expelling governors, or forcing rulers out when trust collapsed. Over time, popular action appears more frequently in the sources, not only in the frontier but across Iberia. Riots, uprisings, and sudden coups show that public pressure could become decisive when legitimacy weakened. Nowhere is this clearer than in the final decades of Islamic rule in Zaragoza. As rulers feuded with rivals and made risky alliances, public frustration rose. At key moments, the people shifted their loyalty, invited alternative leaders, rejected broken promises, and opened gates to new rulers when they judged their own leaders no longer worthy. In the final turmoil, a judge emerged as a practical spokesman, filling the vacuum until the community made its choice and brought in outside power to restore order. This was not random chaos. In Islamic political culture, legitimacy depended on recognition by the community. Authority was not simply inherited power, enforced by a narrow warrior class. It required acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement could be withdrawn. As central control weakened and identity distinctions faded over time, local government became even more dependent on negotiation and communal agreement. This public character also appears in war. Ordinary townspeople did not always wait for professional armies to save them. Local forces defended coastal cities from foreign raids, resisted attacks on frontier towns, and launched counter-raids to relieve pressure on besieged allies. Cities sent cavalry to defend neighbouring strongholds, and during major battles even civilians are described as taking part in desperate sorties. At the same time, political conflict did not mean the population had become passive. When rulers fought for survival, or tried to resist outside domination, they could still mobilise large forces that included local cavalry and infantry. Different factions drew support from different segments of the population. The frontier was not a land of softened, indifferent subjects. It was a society where defence was seen as a shared responsibility, and where community action could shape both war and government. If the Islamic frontier sometimes appears less militarised than its Christian neighbours, this is partly a matter of comparison. Christian society in the north often defined status through warfare. In the frontier, military readiness existed, but it lived alongside trade, scholarship, farming and urban life. The result was a distinctive political culture, not simply authoritarian rule from above, but a constant negotiation between rulers, local elites and the wider population that they needed in order to survive. On the Ebro frontier, power changed hands often, and that instability tells us something important about how rule was understood. In much of the medieval Islamic world, authority was less about fixed borders on a map and more about obedience from people. A ruler's reach expanded or shrank depending on who accepted his leadership, who paid, and who could be protected. When loyalty shifted, the shape of a realm could change quickly without needing to redraw a precise boundary line. This way of thinking about power also made the region surprisingly resilient during political upheavals. Law and everyday governance did not always collapse when dynasties fell, because religious courts and legal customs could continue across political lines. People could negotiate the terms of submission, even with new rulers, as long as community life and religious justice were allowed to function. In that sense, many residents cared less about which banner flew above the walls, and more about whether security, order and familiar institutions would survive. Political change could roll over the surface while daily life continued underneath. Before Christian expansion took control of the region, the frontier economy was driven mainly by farming, but it was not a simple rural backwater. The countryside produced cereals and olives, but also vineyards, orchards and garden crops. In many districts, irrigation was the key. Water management demanded coordination, labour and technical knowledge, and it reshaped settlement patterns over time. New techniques arrived with newcomers, yet older systems did not vanish overnight. In many areas, practices inherited from earlier eras continued alongside new methods, creating a patchwork landscape where tradition and innovation blended. Archaeology suggests that change was uneven. Where immigrant settlement was stronger, new irrigation methods and rural organisation appeared faster. Elsewhere, older structures were expanded rather than replaced. Wells, channels and distribution networks show multiple technical styles across the region, and their spread likely depended on local circumstance, community cooperation, and the availability of labour. Farming was never just about crops. It was about the social arrangements that made production possible. Rural work was also shaped by flexible partnerships. Land, labour, animals, tools and seed could be combined in different ways, with risk shared between participants. Some agreements favoured the landowner, others compensated labour more generously when work was harder, especially on irrigated plots. Long-term crops like vines and trees encouraged arrangements that recognised delayed returns. These practical solutions supported a mobile countryside where many producers could enter agreements, move between opportunities, and combine farming with crafts or trade. Trade itself connected the frontier to a wider world. Coinage circulated, markets linked town and countryside, and goods moved through routes that reached across the Mediterranean and beyond. Still, the backbone of the economy remained agricultural production. Towns mattered as centres of markets, administration and services, but the villages and their fields carried the greatest weight. The frontier was also deeply plugged into the larger Islamic world. Students travelled, scholars moved between cities, families kept ties across the sea, and merchants carried products and information along long-distance routes. Early on, cultural fashions from the East were copied enthusiastically. Over time, however, a distinct local identity hardened. people in Iberia began to see themselves not only as part of a global religious community, but also as belonging to a specific Western land with its own style, habits, and political instincts. In the Ebro borderlands, that regional identity was sharpened by life on the edge. Frontier rulers bargained with distant powers, played rivals against each other, and sometimes negotiated with Christian neighbours to strengthen their own position. Local politics often aimed at autonomy, and this habit of independence went back generations. Tensions also existed inside the Muslim population itself. Where North African forces gained influence, many locals resented being ruled by outsiders. This was not just politics. It could feel like a struggle over status, culture, and who truly belonged. Documents and stories from the period suggest that people distinguish between local communities and incoming regimes, and that this distinction shaped alliances and rebellions. In moments of crisis, local populations sometimes chose their own path, even if it meant defying rulers who claimed religious legitimacy. All of these forces shaped the frontier's final centuries. Political authority could change rapidly, yet society often adapted by negotiating survival. Farming continued, water still had to be managed, markets still had to function, and communities still needed justice and security. The Ebro frontier was not simply conquered. It was transformed through repeated transitions where identity, economy, and power kept shifting, but the deeper structures of daily life fought to endure. By the 11th century, the Ebro frontier had become deeply rooted in Islamic civilization. This was not a shallow or fragile conversion. The ground had already been prepared long before, and when Islam arrived, it spread quickly and decisively. Even though the region lay at the edge of the Muslim world and remained in constant contact with Christian neighbours, it did not drift toward ambiguity. Instead, it became a confident participant in a civilization that stretched across continents. The people of the frontier defined themselves clearly. They did so not only in opposition to nearby Christian kingdoms, but also in distinction from the great southern capitals and from North Africa. This sense of identity was shaped by frontier life itself. Independence, negotiation, and adaptability became habits. Islam did not remain confined to courts or cities. It reached villages, fields, and hamlets, carried by teachers, judges, and everyday practice. Local society was layered. Alongside Christians and Jews who remained in the region, there was a Berber presence whose exact influence is hard to measure. Over time, these newcomers did not form a separate world. They were absorbed gradually into local culture. Family organization followed patterns familiar across the Islamic world, especially among elites and urban groups, though often more as custom than rigid rule. Authority rested less on institutions and more on reputation and consent. Rulers and scholars alike needed recognition from the community, not merely titles. Economically, the frontier lived from the land. Dry grain farming inherited from earlier eras existed side by side with intensive irrigation and market gardening that linked the region to the wider Mediterranean world. Villages, water systems, and fortified rural districts reflected a society organized in segments rather than rigid hierarchies. This structure proved crucial when political power shifted. Communities were able to negotiate their survival even when ruling elites disappeared, allowing Islamic society to endure under Christian domination. Religion mattered more than ancestry. When leaders failed and borders collapsed, scholars and communities looked not to local traditions for rescue, but outward to Islamic powers they believed still embodied religious strength. North African movements, culturally foreign yet deeply devout, were welcomed as protectors of faith rather than outsiders. The fall of the Muslim states along the Ebro was not a single event, but part of a long sequence of encounters between Christian and Muslim powers. In earlier centuries, northern kings had paid tribute to the frontier cities. By the late 11th century, the balance reversed. Muslim rulers now paid heavily for peace and protection, yet power on both sides was fragmented. Christian and Muslim realms alike were divided, competitive, and unstable. Alliances were forged as often within religions as across them. The frontier was never a simple line of separation. It was a zone of interaction. Warfare was constant, but so was exchange. Political alliances linked rulers across religious divides. Merchants traded. Prisoners were captured, ransomed, and sometimes absorbed into new societies. Culture blurred at every level. Politics across the frontier became deeply entangled. Muslim cities and Christian kingdoms played active roles in one another's struggles. Tribute became a tool of diplomacy. Paying one ruler often secured protection against another. In some years, a city might pay several powers at once, balancing threats on all sides. Agreements could bind allies into conflicts they never sought, pulling them into wars far from their own interests. Religion did not disappear from these calculations, but it rarely dictated them. Prestige came from victory, survival, and dominance, not simply from fighting unbelievers. Rulers took titles based on defeating rivals of their own faith as readily as enemies across the border. Strategy mattered more than ideology. Christian princes maneuvered in the same way. They exploited divisions among Muslim neighbours, just as Muslim rulers exploited rivalries among Christians. Alliances shifted quickly. Tribute was renegotiated. Promises were broken when circumstances changed. What mattered was advantage in the moment. This constant manoeuvring created a political culture shaped less by holy war than by realism. Confessional identity set the boundaries of loyalty, but within those boundaries power was flexible. Cooperation across faiths was not an exception. It was routine. Military alliances were not the only function of treaties along the Ebro frontier. These agreements also opened the door to trade, allowing goods produced in Muslim lands to circulate freely among Christian societies. Tribute payments and expanding commercial links with the Latin world increased Christian purchasing power, while routes through Catalonia and the pilgrimage roads to Santiago connected the frontier economy to wider European markets. Agreements made with Muslim rulers were treated with the same seriousness as those concluded between Christian powers. Already in the mid-11th century, authorities in Barcelona demanded that truces with Muslims be respected. The consequences of violating such agreements could be severe. In one notable incident, a Christian king ordered the execution of several nobles after they attacked a protected caravan. While such an act may also have served to discipline an unruly aristocracy, it demonstrates that harming Muslim traders under treaty protection was considered a grave offence. Later attempts by church authorities to forbid diplomatic contact across religious lines had little impact on everyday political practice. Diplomatic cooperation did not rest solely on coercion or economic advantage. Personal relationships between ruling elites were constant and often intimate. From the earliest decades after the Muslim conquest, marriage ties, fosterage, and shared military interests connected leaders across confessional boundaries. Muslim rulers hosted Christian nobles at their courts, attended dynastic weddings, and exchanged formal letters that openly recognized one another's legitimacy. The language used in these communications may appear ceremonial, but it reflects a mutual understanding of authority that transcended religious difference. This pattern is especially visible in the lives of displaced Muslim princes. When political upheaval stripped them of power, exile in Christian territory was not only possible but common. Some Muslim leaders entered the service of Christian kings, received lands, commanded troops, and fought in campaigns that advanced Christian interests. Their loyalty was measured not by faith, but by service and usefulness. These figures were treated as rulers in their own right, even when their religion set them apart. The frontier's ambiguity is even clearer when viewed through the actions of individuals rather than states. Soldiers of fortune moved easily between Muslim and Christian employers, seeking opportunity wherever it appeared. The most famous of these figures was the Castilian warrior later known as the Cid, but he was far from unique. His career, stripped of a later nationalist myth-making, reveals a man who fought for Muslim rulers as readily as for Christian ones, commanded mixed armies, and earned the trust of Islamic courts. To the people of one Muslim capital, he was not an enemy, but a celebrated defender, admired for his skill and reliability. Other figures followed similar paths. Mozarabs raised in Islamic cities rose to prominence as administrators and diplomats, serving Muslim rulers before entering Christian service without controversy. Their knowledge of both worlds made them invaluable intermediaries. Some governed newly conquered cities by promoting accommodation rather than repression, attempting to preserve stability in societies shaped by centuries of Islamic rule. Even lesser-known warriors crossed the religious divide. Christian nobles fought in Muslim armies, while Muslim commanders led forces alongside Christian allies. In some cases, frontier fortresses changed hands not through siege, but through personal agreements and betrayal. Shared military culture created bonds that often outweighed confessional loyalty. Soldiers recognized one another as professionals long before they saw one another as enemies. This pattern extended beyond Iberia. Wherever Christian and Muslim powers confronted one another in the medieval world, similar relationships emerged. In the Western Mediterranean, as in the eastern lands of the Crusades, warfare did not erase negotiation, cooperation, or mutual dependence. The frontier was not a rigid wall separating civilizations, but a shifting zone where identities overlapped, loyalties were negotiated, and survival depended on flexibility. Contact across the frontier did not occur only through war. Peaceful exchange, especially trade, was a constant feature of life along the Ebro. This is visible in subtle ways, such as the adoption of Muslim systems of weights and measures by Christian communities even before large-scale conquest took place. It also appears clearly in agreements designed to keep borders open for merchants, such as arrangements between Navarre and Zaragoza. Archaeological finds reinforce this picture. Fragments of Islamic pottery from the 10th and 11th centuries discovered in northern towns demonstrate that manufactured goods from Muslim territories crossed the frontier regularly, even during periods of tension. There is little reason to believe that this flow of trade was interrupted by Christian military advances in the 12th century. In fact, the Muslim caravan whose attack so enraged a Christian king was travelling toward a Christian-controlled city. As elsewhere in the medieval Mediterranean, warfare and commerce existed side by side. Conflict often opened new markets, encouraged demand, and brought unfamiliar goods to new consumers. Exchange was not limited to merchandise. Ideas, skills, and technologies also moved across the frontier. In Christian lands, monasteries played an early role in this process. Northern religious centres became gateways through which Arabic scientific and intellectual traditions entered Latin Europe. In Muslim territory, the primary setting for such interaction was the court, where learning, patronage, and political power converged. Intellectual exchanges could take the form of formal debates, correspondence, or personal encounters. Given the greater technical and cultural sophistication of Muslim society at the time, this flow largely moved from south to north, accelerating after Christian conquests made Arabic knowledge more accessible. Another powerful channel of contact arose from frontier raiding and the capture of prisoners. Life along the border produced a steady stream of captives. Some were sold far from their homes, while others were held only until ransom could be arranged. Documents and chronicles describe families taken during raids and released years later through negotiated payments or guarantees. Such practices were common and widely documented by both Christian and Muslim sources. Although captivity heightened fear of the religious other, it must be remembered that insecurity was universal in this era. Ordinary people often feared violence from their own rulers as much as from enemies across the frontier. In a world where raiding and trading frequently overlapped, the ransoming of captives functioned as another form of exchange. As harsh as it may sound, this traffic in human lives contributed to communication between communities. much as economic exchange often does, both in the past and today. When we step back and look at the Ebro region as a whole, a faint sense of shared regional identity begins to emerge. At times, this sense of belonging crossed religious boundaries. Language, culture, ethnicity, and even faith were not fixed barriers. People living along the frontier cannot be reduced simply to Muslim or Christian categories. Yet this cultural blending alone does not explain the full reality of the period. Alongside cooperation and exchange existed deliberate expressions of hostility, framed through powerful ideologies of struggle. Both Islam and Christianity developed narratives that cast the frontier as a battlefield of faith. In the Islamic worldview, the world was divided between lands under Muslim rule and lands beyond it. Believers were expected to defend and expand the community through armed struggle when required. This struggle included moral effort, but it also carried a clear military meaning. In the early centuries of Muslim rule in Iberia, this obligation was expressed through regular raids against neighbouring Christian territories. These expeditions brought material rewards as well as religious merit, and were often described in sources with little moral reflection. For a long time, ideology played a secondary role to practical concerns. Political alliances crossed religious lines whenever it proved useful. This changed gradually after the collapse of central authority in the early 11th century. As Muslim power fractured and Christian kingdoms grew stronger, conflict increasingly came to be described in religious terms. External pressures, economic disruption, and internal division all contributed to a growing sense of crisis within Muslim Iberia. A turning point came with the sack of a frontier city in the mid-11th century. Christian forces, aided by warriors from beyond the peninsula, captured the town under promises of safe passage, only to massacre the departing population. Although the city was later retaken, the brutality of the event shocked Muslim society and reinforced the idea of a wider struggle between faiths. From this point onward, writers increasingly framed political decline as a consequence of moral failure and religious compromise. Religious scholars criticized local rulers for luxury, division, and reliance on tribute paid to Christian powers. They called for outside intervention by stricter and more militant Muslim forces from North Africa. Yet the arrival of these outsiders did not bring unity. Instead, it deepened internal tensions and weakened trust between rulers and subjects. As a result, the spirit of collective religious struggle faded, even as military pressure intensified. In practice, ideology rarely dictated behaviour. Muslims cooperated with Christian conquerors when it suited their interests, just as Christians allied with Muslim rulers when expedient. Even dramatic displays of religious violence often served political purposes rather than purely spiritual ones. Both sides used the language of faith to justify actions already decided for practical reasons. The same pattern appears in Christian ideology. Ideas later known as conquest and crusade existed, but they were applied selectively. Legends of early Christian victories portrayed personal conflicts as cosmic struggles, transforming local disputes into symbols of divine destiny. These stories were often written long after the events they described and reflected the priorities of foreign clerics seeking to impose a unified religious narrative on a fragmented past. There was certainly an awareness that the peninsula had once been Christian and might become so again. Charters, chronicles, and royal statements occasionally expressed this belief in stark religious language. Kings granted lands not yet conquered, maintained church offices in exile, and invoked divine favour for their campaigns. Yet such expressions did not prevent alliances with Muslim rulers or peaceful coexistence with Muslim subjects. Christian attitudes toward Muslims remained deeply ambivalent. Muslims could be portrayed as enemies of the faith in one context and loyal subjects in another. This contradiction persisted well into the 13th century. Rulers who celebrated expulsions in one moment might pursue policies of protection and accommodation in the next. Ideology provided a language of justification, but it rarely determined action. The crusading mood that rose in the late 11th century did not suddenly rewrite the rules of life in Iberia. It gave people a louder language for faith and conflict, but it did not replace the older habits of the frontier. For centuries, Christian and Muslim neighbours had fought, negotiated, traded, and hired each other. That pattern continued even as the border shifted south, and new campaigns pushed deeper toward the Mediterranean coast and beyond. Some modern arguments suggest that Crusade thinking produced a sharp change in how Christian rulers treated Muslim populations. But the record in Iberia does not support a dramatic turning point, not in the 12th century and not later. A few high-profile operations did attract foreign fighters and framed warfare as spiritually meaningful, yet the campaigns themselves still matched the familiar rhythm of local expansion, rivalry, and opportunism that had shaped the northern kingdoms for generations. Christian unity too remained fragile. Alliances among Christian princes rarely lasted beyond immediate need. When major battles rearranged the balance of power, Christian rulers were just as willing to seek help from Muslim forces as they were to cooperate with fellow Christians. In moments of danger, self-preservation mattered more than slogans. Long truces and border agreements were often cold calculations about who would take which territory, designed to avoid wasting strength on each other while bigger threats loomed. Meanwhile, pious phrases in charters about serving Christianity and defeating Muslims frequently functioned as standard wording, repeated out of habit rather than proof of a constant burning religious program. While these frontier games played out along the Ebro, life in the Pyrenees followed its own logic. Even at the height of the Southern Caliphate's power, Muslim influence thinned as it climbed into the high valleys. Mountain communities experienced the Islamic presence mainly through tribute obligations and recurring raids, not through direct rule. In the west, a kingdom centered on Pamplona held a shaky dominance over a chain of valleys and upland districts. Farther east, the Mediterranean coast north of Barcelona slipped from Muslim control early, and local counts and monasteries tried to manage a dangerous frontier zone where settlers pushed outward into lands that official documents sometimes described as barren or empty. Those descriptions can mislead. In many cases, words like deserted or depopulated did not mean that nobody lived there. They often meant something closer to unorganized or not yet governed under Christian authority. Some texts even dramatized landscapes as wild deserts, while archaeology shows steady human presence. The language was political as much as geographical. In these mountain lands, law and power were shaped by terrain. Custom varied valley by valley, stitched together loosely by older legal traditions. Communities were fragmented and local. Then, around the year 1000, a transformation began. People increasingly clustered in villages and small towns. Scattered homesteads faded. Castles rose everywhere, not simply as shelters against outside enemies, but as tools for controlling neighbours and asserting domestic dominance. Land that had once been taken freely from the frontier began to fall under lordly control. Population pressure likely intensified this trend, pushing settlement outward and forcing societies to organise defence and authority more tightly. A major political shift followed the division of a larger realm among heirs in the mid-11th century, when a new Aragonese kingdom formed around a modest centre in the north. From these beginnings it expanded aggressively, as successive rulers took strongholds in the foothills and then pressed toward the Ebro. Confidence grew with each victory. Even everyday habits changed, such as how official documents dated events. Earlier generations sometimes marked years by referencing nearby Muslim rulers, a practice that faded as Christian power strengthened, and local rulers no longer felt the need to acknowledge their southern neighbours in formal writing. As expansion continued, rulers in Aragon and Barcelona tried to build stronger central authority. Kings and counts struggled against powerful nobles who resisted being treated as subjects rather than partners. In Catalonia, the leading count pushed to dominate rival counts, convened assemblies, and promoted clearer legal order. Similar projects unfolded in Aragon, yet noble resistance was constant, and the most powerful families often fought centralisation with open defiance. Violence among Christian elites was chronic. Noble feuds, raids, and banditry made everyday security uncertain. Church leaders tried to create zones of refuge and promoted movements meant to restrain warfare, but these efforts rarely solved the problem. Even later rulers who attempted tougher enforcement could not fully suppress the culture of private war. A dynastic marriage eventually joined Aragon and Barcelona under one ruling house, creating a stronger regional power. But this union did not automatically tame the nobility. The internal struggle between monarch and magnates remained a defining feature of the new realm. Interestingly, conquest created different social outcomes in different places. In older upland territories, signs of tightening lordly control grew over time, but in newly conquered zones, rulers often granted freedoms to attract settlers and soldiers. Frontier towns received charters that protected rights and encouraged migration. Because common people were expected to help defend these lands, many communities gained a more flexible social structure. Owning arms, keeping a horse, or serving in local defence could lift a family's status and blur rigid class lines. Monarchs also leaned on monasteries and military religious institutions to administer new territories, using them as a counterweight to overmighty nobles and as a brake on harsh forms of lordship. Still, the conquest of the Ebro must be understood first as war. From the mid-11th century onward, the borderlands were shaped by raids, mounted expeditions, short sieges, and sudden strikes. Christian lords gradually took ground, while Muslim rulers tried to recover what they lost, sometimes retaking towns in counterattacks. The campaigns could look chaotic, but the strongest rulers were not merely chasing loot. They pursued long-term strategies such as isolating major cities before attacking them. By the late 11th century, the outlook for Muslim powers in the region darkened. A major city in the centre of the peninsula fell to a powerful Christian king, and only outside intervention slowed further losses. As that Christian realm later slipped into disorder, Aragon seized the initiative. Within a few decades, much of the former frontier zone fell under Aragonese control. Then a crisis struck. The sudden death of a key conqueror without a clear heir threw the kingdom into confusion and threatened recent gains. Rivals moved quickly to exploit the moment. A neighbouring Christian ruler claimed authority over the greatest prize city, while forces from North Africa pushed into key areas and temporarily relieved several Muslim strongholds. But this resurgence did not last. The united Aragonese and Catalan leadership gradually recovered lost territory and continued the advance. Towns along the southern bank of the Ebro and key plains farther inland were brought under their influence. The dream of pushing all the way to the rich lands of the Mediterranean coast began to take shape. A wide cast of participants joined this expansion. Local nobles fought for land and status. Foreign knights arrived seeking reward. Merchants followed the armies, looking for profit. Monasteries, bishops, and military religious institutions provided organisation, settlement programs, and administrative control. Everyone had something to gain from the wealth of conquered regions. Yet the frontier remained dangerous for a long time. Even after decisive battles elsewhere weakened Muslim power, the borderlands continued to experience raids and skirmishes. Full security came only later, after further southern campaigns in the 13th century. One of the striking features of this conquest is how often it avoided mass slaughter. Many towns were not taken by storm but by pressure and negotiation. Muslim communities frequently chose surrender when leadership was weak, outside help failed, or internal divisions made prolonged resistance impossible. In return, conquerors commonly offered guarantees, safe departure for those who wished to leave, protection and limited autonomy for those who stayed, and tribute arrangements that allowed daily life to continue under new rule. In several key moments, the gates opened not because walls collapsed, but because the population calculated that survival was better served through an agreement than through a doomed defence. A Muslim chronicle describes how Alfonso I tightened his siege around Zaragoza for months, until hunger and pressure forced the city to negotiate. The agreement was blunt and practical. Zaragoza would be handed over to the Christian king. Muslims who wanted to remain could do so by paying a head tax, while anyone who preferred to leave would be allowed to travel safely to Muslim-held territory. The city itself would be reorganised so that Christians lived inside the main urban core while Muslims were settled in a separate quarter outside the walls. Christian captives held in the city were to be released and returned. Then both sides sealed the arrangement with formal pledges, written guarantees, and a binding treaty meant to hold. From the Muslim point of view, this kind of deal could make sense. Frontiers shifted constantly. So many residents may have assumed the Christian takeover might not last forever. And even after earlier betrayals elsewhere, people did not automatically conclude that every Christian promise was worthless. What mattered was whether the terms offered in that moment could prevent disaster. Zaragoza's surrender was not an isolated story. It matches the pattern Alfonso and later rulers used again and again. The reasons were on both sides. Muslim communities were often exhausted by years of instability that damaged security and weakened local economies. Many were also disillusioned with their leadership and skeptical that outside Muslim powers would save them. On the Christian side, armies had momentum, but they lacked enough manpower to occupy every hostile city by force. They also had political rivals to worry about, and they needed conquered lands to keep producing food and revenue. Negotiation, therefore, was not weakness, it was efficiency. Muslims wanted safety and a measure of self-rule. Christian rulers wanted sovereignty and a reliable flow of taxes. Those goals could coexist. The same logic appeared in Catalonia a generation later. When Tortosa fell in the mid-12th century, the process looked strikingly familiar. A hard siege, heavy pressure, then a negotiated handover. The surrender agreement echoed earlier models so closely that it seems both sides already understood what kinds of concessions were possible. Muslim residents were given time to relocate to a suburb outside the walls, and they were allowed continued access to their main mosque during the transition. More importantly, the agreement protected a real degree of legal autonomy. Muslims were to be judged by their own law. Christian testimony was restricted in certain cases, and even official searches of homes were limited. Similar terms were then reused as templates for other towns. Only a handful of these surrender documents still survive, but the repeating structure is hard to miss. In exchange for tribute, Muslim communities were typically granted religious practice, local self-management, and the freedom to move. A common requirement was that Muslims shift their residence outside the fortified core within about a year. These were not usually one-sided commands. They were deals negotiated between a Christian commander and the Muslim population, often through local leaders, and sometimes those leaders were allowed to keep a governing role under the new regime. The heart of the bargain was always the same. Muslims could continue to live by Islamic law. At the time, community identity was deeply tied to the legal system people followed. That made legal continuity the most natural and necessary concession. It was not simply a prize won through bargaining strength. It was the foundation that made coexistence possible, because in Islamic society, law and religion were inseparable. What is most striking is how long these agreements lasted. Some were written to cover not just the current generation, but their descendants, and even allowed refugees to return and reclaim property. Later, kings repeatedly confirmed earlier privileges, sometimes centuries after a town's surrender. That habit of reconfirmation reveals a basic truth about the conquest. Whatever slogans appeared in official language, the aim was usually control and revenue, not immediate expulsion. Documents that sound like they announce a total cleansing often meant the removal of Islamic political authority, not the disappearance of Muslim residents. In practice, Muslims frequently remained. This pattern did not end in the Ebro Valley. Similar policies were applied later in Valencia, where detailed surrender agreements show Christian rulers granting whatever freedoms were necessary to keep Muslim communities peaceful and productive. Different cultures could describe these arrangements in different legal languages, but the reality was recognizable. Muslims were prepared to live under Christian sovereignty if their essential religious and social needs were respected. These treaties also fit Christian administrative habits. Christian rulers were already issuing settlement charters to attract people to frontier towns, offering rights and protections in exchange for loyalty and service. Extending comparable guarantees to Muslim communities was simply another version of the same governing tool, a contract that stabilized a population and kept an economy working. Some historians caution that we should not assume every town and village received identical terms because so few documents survive. That caution is fair, but there is strong indirect evidence that similar provisions were widespread, especially since the region's rural life was organised through networks of towns and hamlets, rather than through tightly managed lordly estates. Christian landlords had little incentive to tear apart functioning systems in newly conquered lands. They needed crops, taxes, and order. And in many places where Muslim populations stayed, older patterns of irrigation, production, and settlement continued, often with the new Christian rulers adapting themselves to existing structures rather than rebuilding everything from scratch. Even when Christian control in the Ebro Valley was still fragile and uneven, the conquest set off a deep shift in population and in the way the economy worked. To understand what later Muslim life under Christian rule looked like, we first have to track what happened to people in those early decades, who left, who stayed and was moved around, and who arrived from the northern Christian lands. For ordinary rural families, the barriers to emigration were even higher. Farmers and wage workers had fields, irrigation rights, tools, and community ties that could not be packed onto animals and carried away. Even so, some did leave, and scattered references point to households that departed and properties that stood empty. But the documents can be ambiguous. A phrase that sounds like someone left the city might mean relocation within the region rather than a full flight to Muslim territory. References to abandoned prayer sites also prove little, because Christian scribes use the same term for many kinds of buildings, from major mosques to minor endowments. What matters is that Christian rulers sometimes tried to reverse departures, inviting Muslims back with promises that they could recover their property and move safely through Christian lands. That kind of clause only makes sense if the authorities wanted a stable, productive Muslim population to remain. Even if emigration was significant in some districts, the communities that stayed were capable of recovering quickly. Islam did not depend on a single rigid institution to function. Literacy in Arabic was widespread enough to support local religious life, and contact with Muslim regions continued. In fact, the early aftermath of conquest could create new opportunities for those who stayed. The disappearance of parts of the old elite could loosen social ceilings, land markets could shift, wages and lease terms might improve in areas where Christian settlers were scarce, but fields still needed workers. In many villages, especially at first, the new Christian presence may have been distant and faint, more visible in taxation than in daily life. At the same time, the demographic picture changed because Christians began moving in. Basques, Navarrese, Mozarabs, Catalans, Aragonese, and migrants from across the Pyrenees entered a landscape that was still largely Muslim. Settlement seems to have been slower than kings would have liked, and rulers used several strategies to speed it up and secure control. Large blocks of territory were claimed for direct royal administration. Other areas were granted to noblemen and foreign knights who had fought in the campaigns, creating new landlords whose loyalty could be tied directly to the crown. Over time, many grant holders tried to turn temporary rewards into hereditary power, with mixed success. Alongside them, the church became a major landholder through dioceses, monasteries, and later military religious institutions, acting as another counterweight to local magnates and as an organising force in frontier administration. By the 12th century, these military orders held vast estates, especially toward the southern frontier where danger still lingered. They arrived early, expanded steadily, and by around 1200 they were among the most influential owners of land in the region. Their role, like the crown's, was not simply religious. It was demographic and economic, keeping settlements alive, keeping fields productive, and keeping authority anchored in territory that still felt uncertain. As Christian rule spread across the Ebro Valley, church institutions often became the immediate beneficiaries of what had previously been Islamic religious property. In many places, the new authorities transferred the income of major places of worship and their attached endowments to bishops and cathedral chapters. The main urban mosque could be reassigned to the local bishop, along with its surrounding buildings, smaller prayer sites, and burial grounds. And the same logic extended to properties that had been tied to religious foundations. Over time, rulers also encouraged church bodies to support expansion by promising them a share of lands that had not even been conquered yet. These forward-looking pledges helped turn future campaigns into joint ventures, with spiritual prestige and material reward pulling institutions into the work of war, settlement and administration. Kings who needed soldiers and garrisons did not rely only on great nobles and bishops. They also rewarded lesser men with houses, plots, or revenue rights on condition that they strengthen defences, keep communities inhabited, and maintain a fighting man. Some grants require the recipient to fortify a position and ensure it stayed populated. Others effectively assigned a dependent rural household and its property to a beneficiary who was expected to fund an armed horseman. Arrangements like these functioned less like private lordship and more like delegated revenue in return for military readiness. The goal was to keep authority public, keep law from breaking into private hands, and keep fighting capacity tied directly to the crown's needs rather than to the ambitions of local power brokers. The pressure for a flexible, always available defence also pushed towns to develop militias. This was especially important in thinly settled frontier districts where raids, banditry and sudden violence were a fact of life. Townspeople were expected to bring whatever weapons they could and serve both in local defence and in the king's mounted expeditions. In return, men who could provide a horse and equipment gained a status that blurred the line between commoner and minor noble. Military service in these zones was not only a burden, it became a recognised marker of belonging and a practical route to local standing. Because the demand could drive settlers away, rulers often limited obligations so that people would still choose to live on the frontier. Some town laws, for example, restricted how long a campaign could last before the community was no longer expected to supply itself, an attempt to balance security with survivability. Militarised settlement produced new institutions as well. Alongside the major international military religious organisations that accumulated wide estates, frontier regions experimented with local brotherhoods and short-lived orders formed to defend settlements, patrol dangerous corridors, and ransom captives. Some of these groups were eventually absorbed into larger organisations, but their appearance shows how urgent security felt and how many different solutions were tried. The broader policy remained consistent. Settlement was treated as a weapon. Charters granting land and privileges repeatedly tied the arrival of residents to the ability to defend territory and hold it against attack. Even places that lay behind the main battle line could be unsafe, because threats did not only come from across the frontier. Rival Christian powers, internal feuds, and criminal violence could be just as destructive. That is why charters sometimes describe forests and rough countryside as hiding places for raiders and thieves, and why rulers framed the building of churches and forts as a single project designed to protect new communities. Because attracting people mattered so much, rulers offered unusually generous terms to draw settlers in. Some frontier towns were granted legal protections and freedoms that served as incentives including provisions that allowed fugitives from justice to rebuild their lives by taking up residence and serving the community. At the same time, absentee ownership threatened these policies. Authorities tried to prevent a situation in which land was handed out on paper but remained empty in reality. Residence was often made a condition of enjoying a town's privileges, and penalties could be imposed on landlords whose houses stood unoccupied. Similar rules continued later in newly founded towns farther south, where grants were limited to people who actually lived there, so that settlement would be real rather than theoretical. Even with these incentives, colonization was rarely immediate. In major cities, the transformation of central religious buildings into cathedrals and the full rollout of Christian municipal law could lag behind conquest by years. Some towns waited more than a decade for a fully developed legal framework aimed at settlers. Early conquest also absorbed much of the available migrant population, which meant that areas beyond the main riverline had to lure newcomers with the particular attractions of frontier life, opportunity, land on favourable terms, and the profits of trade and war. In some places, recipients were required to build new houses, a clear sign that settlers were not simply stepping into abandoned neighbourhoods. As the frontier moved farther south and the region stabilised, the Ebro Valley began to develop a more regular shape. Different legal patterns hardened in different zones, reflecting who held power and how wealth was made. Some older regions followed town-centred traditions shaped by merchants and urban communities, while the river corridor tended to fall under the influence of a narrower local elite. In the sparsely settled frontier districts, strong town councils retained wide authority and sometimes exercised control over surrounding villages in ways that looked like lordship. In the countryside, land and revenue ended up divided among the crown, the church, noble families, private holders, municipal bodies, monasteries, and especially the military religious organisations, which expanded their influence as landlords. This created long-running tension over jurisdiction and privilege, with nobles and institutions trying to broaden their rights while the crown attempted to keep a direct grip on courts, taxation, and public utilities. Yet the Ebro did not become a classic feudal landscape in the strongest sense. A large part of the population remained legally mobile, and many people worked land through arrangements that did not resemble heavy servitude. Strong royal taxation and claims over military obligations helped preserve the crown's reach, and legal currents drawn from older Roman traditions could support central authority rather than local fragmentation. Conditions differed in older heartland areas farther north and east, where harsh lordly rights, deep peasant dependence and heavy seigneurial customs were more common. The Ebro zone, shaped by conquest and by the constant need to keep people on the land, tended to resist the most extreme forms of rural subjection. To grasp what changed after conquest, we also have to separate two kinds of redistribution that the documents often blur. One was fiscal and administrative. The right to collect rents, taxes and dues from a property or district could be granted to a magnate, a cleric, a monastery or a military organisation, as payment for service or as an incentive for future support. This kind of grant might change the name of the person receiving revenue while leaving the actual residence in place, whether Muslim or Christian. The other was redistribution of use and settlement, land given to individuals on the expectation that they would live there, cultivate it, and build homes. The first category could have little immediate impact on daily life in a village. The second could reshape a landscape, but it usually did so only in places that were genuinely underpopulated or had suffered major departures. That distinction matters because early records are filled with phrases that identify holdings by linking them to a previous owner. Many grants describe a field, garden, mill, shop, or house as having belonged to a named Muslim, and some readers have assumed this automatically proves that the owner fled. Often it proves nothing of the sort. It can simply be a practical label, a way of describing a plot in a patchwork landscape by naming the person everyone associated with it. In later generations, the same labelling could be applied even when the land had already passed through multiple hands, and it could be used for Christian owners as well. The persistence of these older labels suggests continuity. New Christian holders were being inserted into an existing system of fields, gardens, and water rights rather than sweeping it away. The strongest proof comes from the borders recorded in these grants. Many documents describe Christian recipients receiving land whose edges were defined by neighbouring Muslim holdings. That means Muslims remained on the land in significant numbers and continued working within the established agricultural grid. In irrigated zones, newcomers could not simply impose a new order without disrupting production. They had to fit into the water schedules, channels, and routines already in place. The same is visible in shared ownership of mills and in other pieces of infrastructure that only functioned if multiple users coordinated. In these situations, it was often the Christian proprietors who adapted to the older systems, learning to operate inside a working landscape that remained, in practice, deeply shaped by the Muslim communities who had built and maintained it. Across the Ebro Valley, the strongest picture that emerges after the Christian takeover is not sudden collapse, but stubborn continuity mixed with gradual change. Farming routines, water management, and patterns of landholding often carried on in recognisable forms wherever Muslim communities remained on the land. Even when a new lord or institution received a village, the grant could explicitly preserve older rights and customary arrangements, as if the landscape's practical logic mattered more than the faith of whoever held power. One of the clearest signs of continuity appears when Muslim families regained land that had once been theirs. Sometimes people who had left during the turmoil returned and resumed life under the new rulers. In other cases, later redistribution reversed earlier transfers. These reversals were not symbolic gestures. They reveal that property memory remained alive, that boundaries and claims were still understood, and that older ownership could still be argued, recognised, and restored. The same caution applies to the avalanche of records describing land as having once belonged to a named Muslim. That phrasing is often just an address label, a way to identify a particular house, shop, orchard, or field inside a dense patchwork of holdings. It does not automatically mean the person fled, nor does it prove a neighbourhood was emptied and refilled by newcomers. In towns, for instance, Muslims were frequently required to move to suburbs outside the walls. A transfer of a house inside the old core might reflect relocation, not exile. And many grants were fiscal rather than residential. What changed hands was the right to collect rent or dues, while the same tenants continued working, living, and paying where they always had. Because property and revenue could be reassigned in small slices, urban layouts could endure for generations, and even today some places still preserve patterns that reach deep into the early medieval period. If the record seems to mention Muslims less than their numbers would suggest, that does not necessarily mean they vanished. In many areas, Muslim communities managed much of their own legal and administrative life, which kept them out of routine Christian legal paperwork. Meanwhile, early Christian settlement often formed clusters. Documents produced inside those clusters naturally describe transactions among Christians and can give a distorted impression of the wider demographic reality. So what happened after conquest is best described as reorganisation rather than mass disappearance. There was movement, of course, and some regions likely saw heavier departures than others, especially places that suffered long stretches of insecurity. But in many of the valley's most densely occupied zones, substantial Muslim communities remained in place across the 12th century and beyond. The shock of conquest should not be exaggerated into a single catastrophic break. Certain institutions linked to earlier political conditions faded because the conditions that produced them had changed. That kind of shift is normal when power structures change, and it does not by itself prove that society was erased. Over time, the region evolved through phases. First came occupation, when new rulers asserted control and stabilised the frontier. Then came settlement and consolidation, As administration thickened, local legal systems multiplied, and landholding became more tightly structured under new authorities. Finally came entrenchment, where military pressure eased, prosperity expanded, and the Christian population gradually became numerically dominant. Through all of this, a new mixed society took shape, made up of Christians from different backgrounds, long-established Muslim communities, and Jewish groups shaped by both Arabic and Latin cultural worlds. Most communities were small, clusters of houses near a fortification, a village bound together by fields and water, or a modest town tied to a local market. Daily life was still threatened by raiding, internal feuds, and the dangers of frontier politics. Yet what stands out is how limited open communal violence seems to have been in many places. Practical interests often cut across religious boundaries. People dealt with one another as neighbours, business partners, tenants and landlords, captives and owners, taxpayers and officials. The frontier remained porous, with movement back and forth driven as much by ordinary needs as by war. What we know about Muslim life under Christian rule is shaped heavily by the kinds of records that survived. Because most of these documents deal with courts and taxes, the story has often been told as if Muslim communities existed mainly as legal exceptions and sources of revenue. Medieval law codes highlighted Muslims and Jews as special subjects, allowing them to retain parts of their own legal traditions while also restricting their access to Christian courts and public life. Over time, this has encouraged an image of Muslims as a group standing apart from the Christian majority, tolerated but isolated, protected only because they were economically useful. From this perspective, Muslim communities appear mainly as taxpayers. They are seen as producers whose labour and payments benefited noble lords, church institutions, and above all the royal treasury. In this view, Muslims seem passive, acted upon rather than acting, defined by what was taken from them rather than by what they shaped. Yet this impression is misleading. The divide between Christian and Muslim society was far less rigid in everyday life than official paperwork suggests. Even while Christian rulers granted Muslim communities a degree of internal autonomy, conquest drew those communities into the wider legal and financial systems of the realm. Over time, older Islamic institutions did not simply survive unchanged. They were reshaped into new forms that fit Christian political structures. By the 13th century, Muslim communal organisation was no longer purely Islamic in character, but neither was it fully absorbed into Christian norms. It had become something new. To understand this transformation, attention must turn to the most visible expression of Muslim collective life after the conquest, the Al-Jama. This body is often treated as the central vessel of Muslim history in Christian lands. That approach makes sense, but only if the Al-Jama is understood as one channel among several through which taxation, justice and governance operated. Muslim society was not internally uniform, and Christian fiscal practices introduced new divisions within communities, sometimes binding Muslims together, sometimes separating them from one another, and sometimes linking them to Christian neighbours in unexpected ways. The Al-Jama was not created by royal decree. It emerged gradually as Muslim communities responded to Christian attempts to manage a realm made up of different peoples and legal traditions. At first, the word simply described a community. Only later did it come to represent something more formal. It was also never used exclusively for Muslims. Jewish communities were described in the same way, and in rare cases the term even referred to mixed populations. This ambiguity reflects the organic way the institution developed. There was no single model. Some Al-Jamas were led by prominent officials with recognised authority. Others relied on councils of elders. Larger towns often had multiple offices operating side by side, while smaller communities may have functioned with minimal structure. What they shared was not uniform organisation, but function. The Al-Jama acted as a representative body when dealing with taxation, legal disputes and collective obligations. It spoke for the community in certain contexts, but not always in all matters, and not necessarily for every Muslim individual living nearby. It is also important to distinguish the al-Jama from the physical Muslim quarters that developed inside or beside towns. These neighbourhoods described where Muslims lived, not how they governed themselves. Only later, as segregation increased, did the two ideas begin to overlap more closely. In its earlier form, the al-Jama was not a district but a body, a framework through which religious life, taxation, and justice were coordinated. In Islamic tradition, these spheres were inseparable, and that understanding continued under Christian rule. Trying to force the al-Jama into a single rigid definition misses the point. Its character varied from place to place and changed over time. A more productive way to understand it is to observe when and how it appears in the sources. Almost always, it emerges in matters of taxation, debt, and legal responsibility. From the viewpoint of the rulers, collective taxation was practical. Authorities demanded a fixed sum from a town or district and left the community to decide how that burden would be shared. This approach applied to Christians as well as Muslims, but the religious diversity of the realm encouraged separate accounting for each group. Taxes were assessed on Christians, Jews, and Muslims independently, even when they lived side by side. At first glance, this system seems to reinforce religious separation. Each group paid as a group, and each appeared to act as a unified bloc. In reality, however, these arrangements often masked internal divisions. Wealth, status, profession, and proximity to power mattered as much as religion. The fiscal framework sometimes strengthened communal identity, but it could just as easily expose inequalities within the community or bind Muslims and Christians together through shared economic interests. During the 13th century, the governing machinery of the crown was far from orderly or fully formed. Rather than a coherent system, administration functioned as a constantly evolving arrangement shaped by expansion, improvisation, and necessity. Borders were still shifting, territories were being added, and rulers struggled to manage lands that were larger, more diverse, and more complex than anything they had controlled before. With limited financial resources and a political structure dominated by monarchs and aristocrats, authority depended heavily on short-term solutions rather than long-term planning. As a result, taxation in practice was far messier than any theoretical framework might suggest. The amount a community was expected to pay depended on a patchwork of influences. These included the original terms of surrender, local charters, special privileges obtained from the king, and the extent to which tax rights had been transferred to others. Royal income could be sold, granted, inherited, or assigned temporarily in return for military service. Each of these arrangements altered who collected taxes and how they were assessed. Although Muslim communities usually paid tribute through their communal institutions, many individuals claimed exemption from royal taxation. These exemptions were often based on ties to secondary authorities such as military orders, monasteries, or noble patrons. Muslims entered such relationships through grants, voluntary submission, inheritance, or family continuity. In these cases, what was transferred was not personal freedom or legal status, but fiscal responsibility. The right to collect taxes from a person could be assigned without any claim over their body, property, or legal standing. This practice applied equally to Christians. Tax rights over individuals, regardless of religion, were routinely exchanged between institutions. Over time, entire Muslim communities could also place themselves under the protection of a powerful patron, thereby redirecting their tax obligations away from the crown. As generations passed, more people could claim exemption by descent, service, or affiliation. Other exemptions arose from holding office within the community or receiving royal favour. Such privileges did not reduce overall revenue, since the remaining burden was simply redistributed among those still liable. Because land and tax rights had been used to reward service and raise armies, many different powers acquired claims over Muslim revenues. These included the king, nobles, military orders, and church institutions. From the late 12th century onward, royal policy increasingly aimed to bring these revenues back under central control. This effort strengthened royal finances, increased income from fines, and weakened the political power of rival elites. Once control was secured, revenues could again be reassigned temporarily to reward loyalty or maintain military readiness. Crucially, these fiscal grants did not normally include legal authority. Muslims were rarely subjected to full lordly jurisdiction. Even when they lived on noble or ecclesiastical lands, their legal status remained protected. Civil cases involving Christians could fall under local courts, but Muslims retained access to royal justice. They could not be imprisoned for debt outside specific royal taxes, nor punished physically without due process. This principle was repeatedly affirmed by kings, who insisted that legal authority over Muslims remained with the crown, regardless of who collected their taxes. Despite these clear boundaries, conflicts were frequent. Municipal officials and noble lords often attempted to overreach, imprisoning Muslims or asserting authority they did not possess. Such actions regularly prompted royal intervention, reminding officials that they had exceeded their powers. These disputes reveal how fragile jurisdictional boundaries remained and how often they were contested in practice. Alongside secular taxation, the Church sought to collect its own revenues. From the earliest conquests, it was accepted that Muslims should not pay religious taxes tied to Christian worship. However, when land had passed into Christian ownership at any point after the conquest, Muslims working that land were expected to contribute ecclesiastical dues. This rule generated constant tension. Religious authorities repeatedly accused Muslims and Christians of cooperating to evade church taxes, especially when land was exchanged across religious lines. Matters were further complicated when kings issued privileges exempting Muslims entirely from certain payments, directly contradicting ecclesiastical claims. The method of tax assessment varied dramatically from place to place. In some towns, taxes were calculated strictly along religious lines. In others, certain levies were shared equally between communities. Elsewhere, the entire population was assessed as a single unit, with internal distribution left unresolved. These differences could even exist side by side within the same town, depending on the type of tax involved. Unsurprisingly, such arrangements produced friction. Disputes between Christians and Muslims over how much each group owed were common, and royal arbitration was frequently required. The lack of uniformity makes it impossible to speak of a single taxation model. Instead, fiscal practice shifted constantly, responding to local conditions, political pressures, and demographic change. On a broader level, taxation both connected and divided communities. By participating in the Crown's fiscal system, Muslims became integrated into a structure grounded in royal authority and customary law, rather than religious prescription. At the same time, collective taxation reinforced religious identity by treating communities as distinct financial units. Yet this process also introduced inequalities within Muslim society. Exemptions benefited a minority, while the remaining population carried a growing burden. Before the conquest, taxation had been personal and tied closely to individual means. Under Christian rule, assessments were increasingly collective and sometimes arbitrary. As exemptions multiplied and population shifted, the balance became harder to maintain. Tensions emerged within Muslim communities as obligations became unevenly distributed. The spread of tax exemptions did not unite Muslim communities in the way one might expect. Instead, it produced internal conflict. Over time, exemption status became hereditary, and the number of Muslims who claimed freedom from communal taxation grew steadily throughout the 13th century. As this privileged group expanded, the financial foundation of Muslim communities weakened. What followed was a period of mounting fiscal strain, marked by constant disputes and legal battles initiated by the communities themselves. Muslim councils increasingly found themselves forced into court, attempting, to strip exemption rights from their own members, especially during the final decades of the century. Royal responses only deepened the crisis. Kings alternated between confirming exemptions, restricting them, or revoking them altogether, creating uncertainty and encouraging further instability. This pattern was not unique to Muslims. Jewish communities faced the same pressures and responded in similar ways, even taking their own leaders to court when exemption claims threatened communal survival. Christian towns experienced parallel tensions. A broad layer of lower nobility enjoyed partial or total freedom from local taxes, and this group formed a significant portion of the population in many regions. Municipal charters often granted exemption to anyone able to provide a horse and arms for military service. Predictably, these privileges became a source of conflict. Councils challenged claims of noble status, while individuals appealed directly to the crown to defend their exemptions. Lawsuits, royal reprimands, and repeated interventions became routine. This aggressive stance taken by councils and communal authorities must be understood in context. Taxable residents frequently attempted to avoid their obligations. Some falsely claimed ties to privileged families or institutions. Others hid their property with accomplices, transferring goods to households that fell outside communal assessments. Moving assets to neighbouring villages was another common tactic. Marriage also became a tool, as individuals sought exemption through unions with privileged families. Though such claims were not always upheld, royal officials were well aware that tax avoidance was widespread across all religious groups. In response, some levies explicitly stated that exempt classes were still required to contribute to specific public expenses, such as maintaining city walls or defences. Even so, resistance was common, and complaints reached the royal court with regularity. Authorities were often forced to intervene when individuals with limited exemptions attempted to claim total immunity from communal obligations. Exemption did not mean freedom from all financial responsibility. Those who enjoyed special status were frequently required to provide extraordinary payments, compulsory loans, or special contributions to the crown or to the institutions that protected them. These demands applied to Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. Exemption reduced some burdens but introduced others, making it inaccurate to describe it simply as tax freedom. Alongside their obligations to Christian authorities, Muslims also continued to support their own religious and communal institutions. Unfortunately, almost no records survive detailing how these internal taxes were collected. Christian administrators had no interest in preserving such information, since it did not affect royal revenue. It is therefore likely that earlier Islamic fiscal practices continued after the conquest, adapting to include the tribute owed to Christian rulers. By the mid-13th century, however, Muslim institutions had devolved, and their internal financial systems must have changed as well. Communities needed resources to maintain mosques, support religious officials, fund charitable activities, and possibly sustain Islamic courts. These needs were likely met through a combination of traditional alms, religious endowments, and income from properties attached to mosques. Occasional references suggest that community officials managed these resources alongside Christian taxes, collecting funds together and distributing them afterward. If so, exemption status would have had serious consequences. Muslims who claimed exemption may have avoided contributing to the upkeep of religious institutions they continued to use. This would have intensified tensions within the community and blurred the boundaries of belonging. Community identity held deep importance in Islamic life, reinforced through shared rituals, collective worship, and mutual obligation. When community leaders denied certain services, such as burial rites, to those who refused to contribute, they were effectively excluding them from the religious body itself. Financial disputes thus became questions of identity and belonging. When Christian taxation was layered onto Muslim society, its effects did not stop within individual communities. It reshaped relations between Muslims and Christians as well. Whenever the weight of taxation became too heavy, communities tried to reduce the burden by pushing responsibility onto others. In towns where Muslims and Christians were taxed together, arguments frequently broke out over how much each group should pay. By contrast, when taxes were imposed without distinguishing between faiths, Muslims and Christians often acted side by side, either resisting the levy altogether or uniting against individuals they regarded as evading their fair share. When taxation was organised according to factors other than religion, such as territory or residency, those criteria became the basis for cooperation. In these situations, shared interests overrode religious difference. The records offer many examples. In one town, a mixed council brought legal action against Muslim landholders who lived elsewhere but owned property locally and refused to pay taxes. In another case, Muslim and Christian authorities worked together for several years to challenge exemption claims made by Muslims protected by a military order. These alliances were not permanent. They emerged when interests aligned and dissolved once circumstances changed. Muslim communities were also fully capable of acting on their own. In one instance, Muslims joined Christians from other towns in refusing to pay a royal tax connected to coinage. Both groups showed a willingness to defy royal authority when they sensed weakness at the centre. After a new king took the throne amid political unrest, Muslims and Christians in one town withheld taxes that had been owed for years. Elsewhere, both communities attempted to avoid payments that replaced military service with cash, or refused hospitality taxes owed to the crown. Resistance was not limited to the monarchy. Communities sometimes challenged their lords as well. In one case, Muslims and Christians together tried to escape the authority of a noble heir by exploiting a legal technicality, claiming he had failed to assert his rights in time. In another episode, a Muslim tenant attempted to shift his fiscal allegiance from one lord to another while keeping the same land, effectively committing fraud. Shared opposition extended even to the church. During the final decade of the 13th century, Muslims and Christians in several towns jointly withheld church dues. In one region, Muslims, Christians and Jews together refused to pay expenses imposed to support papal envoys. Elsewhere, mixed communities openly ignored royal orders to pay taxes owed to monasteries until stronger decrees were issued. At times, Muslim communities resisted on their own. One Muslim council refused to deliver a traditional payment owed to a local church, possibly because the money was intended for church repairs. Muslims were often particularly sensitive when taxes seemed to connect them, even indirectly, to Christian religious practice. In certain cases, royal officials acknowledged these concerns and reduced or cancelled Muslim contributions. In others, Muslim resistance relied on weak legal arguments, such as delaying payment by invoking temporary royal debt relief. Tax pressure did not only provoke legal disputes, on occasion it triggered violence. In one dramatic incident, a large group of Muslims physically attacked a royal tax officer attempting to collect a coinage levy. The confrontation ended only after a substantial payment was made, and a general pardon was issued. In another town, armed Muslims threatened to kill a royal messenger sent to collect an extraordinary tax. An investigation later revealed that some of the community's leading figures had been involved. During the 13th century, several forces combined to deepen the sense of financial strain felt by tax-paying communities. Above all stood the almost permanent state of crisis faced by the crown itself. Military threats abroad and instability at home placed constant pressure on royal finances. Muslim uprisings in Valencia, wars with neighbouring kingdoms, and repeated rebellions by powerful nobles in Aragon and Catalonia pushed the rulers to demand extraordinary taxes again and again. One such moment came when a special levy was imposed exclusively on Muslim communities, requiring the largest Muslim councils to send delegates to the capital to decide how the burden would be shared. These emergency demands did not occur in a stable fiscal environment. Taxes were often based on long-standing custom rather than current conditions, even though population levels, agricultural output, migration, and political turmoil had all changed dramatically over time. Only occasionally were these realities acknowledged in formal agreements. One early arrangement allowed for reassessment if population levels shifted, with reviews carried out in consultation with respected members of the Muslim community. More commonly, kings intervened on a case-by-case basis. In one village dispute, royal officials were sent to conduct household-by-household evaluations after accusations that one community had manipulated evidence to reduce its own share. Beyond reassessments, rulers sometimes granted temporary relief. When Muslim communities demonstrated hardship, certain taxes were suspended or reduced. These decisions reflected a clear royal calculation. Maintaining productive and stable Muslim populations served the interests of the crown. Yet such gestures were selective and strategic rather than systematic. Two main mechanisms emerged to correct the gap between fixed tax expectations and real economic capacity. One was the continued use of extraordinary levies, the other was negotiation. Muslim councils became skilled at requesting tax reductions, presenting petitions that cited poverty, damage, or instability. These appeals should not always be read as proof of genuine destitution. Often they functioned as political tools, especially during moments when royal authority was weak and loyalty was uncertain. Periods marked by widespread tax relief often coincided with political vulnerability at the centre. Newly crowned rulers, or kings facing unrest and disorder, proved more receptive to such requests. In this way, Muslim communities adapted quickly to the logic of Christian administration, learning how to use its mechanisms to protect their own interests. Even when a council lacked funds, this did not necessarily mean its members were poor. Wealthier families were often shielded by exemptions, leaving the communal treasury strained. Importantly, financial stress was not unique to Muslim communities. Christian and Jewish populations also received tax relief during the same period. Monasteries, towns, and villages of every faith appealed for reductions after war damage, failed harvests, or prolonged instability. Entire settlements were granted partial forgiveness of heavy fines, while others were allowed delays or cancellations of payments tied to military service or hospitality obligations. When surviving records from a typical tax year are examined, a clear pattern emerges. Communities of all religious backgrounds frequently paid only a fraction of what they were originally assessed. Muslim councils received reductions similar in scale to those granted to Jewish and Christian groups. This shows that tax levels alone cannot be used as a measure of prosperity or privilege. Any attempt to evaluate Muslim contributions to the royal treasury is further complicated by the fragmented nature of authority. The crown did not control all taxation. Many individuals and communities owed payments to local lords, religious institutions, or military orders. These overlapping obligations often cut across religious boundaries, encouraging alliances that ignored faith in favour of shared interest. Some individuals even fell under multiple tax regimes at once, holding land from different masters. This situation created opportunities to evade obligations, especially among those associated with powerful institutions that claimed broad exemptions. Rulers were forced repeatedly to remind such subjects that exemption from one authority did not cancel obligations to another. Although the Muslim Council was often a loosely defined body when it came to taxation, there were moments when it clearly functioned as a formal collective. In certain situations, it acted and was treated as a single legal entity, capable of responsibility, negotiation, and defence. This collective role emerged most clearly in disputes over taxes, shared debts, the management of communal assets, and the administration of justice. In matters of loans and obligations, the council frequently intervened on behalf of its members. It sought payment delays, negotiated debt relief, and sometimes helped shield individuals from creditors. In many cases, these financial conflicts took on a religious dimension, largely because a significant portion of lenders were Jewish. While it's impossible to know how many requests for relief were rejected, the number that succeeded shows that Muslim communities were often effective in pressing their case for reduced or delayed repayment. When confronted by creditors, Muslim councils drew on a wide range of tactics. Some disputes involved questionable documents, selective interpretations of custom, or prolonged legal challenges designed to exhaust the opposing side. These conflicts sometimes extended beyond the Muslim community itself. On occasion, Muslims found common cause with nearby Christian neighbours, forming temporary alliances that could even escalate into open hostility toward Jewish lenders, especially when those lenders came from outside the local area and lacked deeper social ties to the community. Not all financial disputes followed the same pattern. Muslims were not always borrowers. In some cases, they acted as creditors and were forced to defend their own claims against powerful debtors who refused to pay. At other times, Muslims became entangled in financial conflicts not of their own making, when authorities attempted to seize their property to settle debts owed by their lords or officials. In such situations, royal authorities usually stepped in to protect Muslim subjects, insisting that property could only be confiscated if a direct legal link to the debtor could be proven. At the same time, there were exceptions. When powerful elites accumulated heavy debts, their dependents, including Muslim followers, could be compelled to stand surety. These cases reveal how deeply Muslim communities had become embedded in the broader fiscal and legal structures of the kingdom. The fact that Muslim councils appear repeatedly as both debtors and creditors demonstrates the strength of their corporate identity. Legal records clearly distinguish between debts contracted by individuals and those assumed by the community as a whole. In some lawsuits, entire Muslim councils were held responsible, while in others liability was limited to named individuals. These distinctions were actively debated and enforced, showing that the council was recognised as a legal person, capable of owning assets, entering agreements, and being subject to seizure just like an individual. Beyond financial disputes, Muslim councils also appear as parties in land transactions, commercial conflicts, and lawsuits against their own officials for abuse of authority. They defended communal rights to land, water, burial grounds, and religious autonomy, and they resisted interference by Christian officials who attempted to bypass Islamic courts or impose external jurisdiction. Such conflicts were not isolated incidents, but recurring features of late 13th century legal life. Collective responsibility, however, did not always align strictly with religious boundaries. In some towns, different corporate bodies operated simultaneously. A Muslim council might appear in one case, while a mixed Christian-Muslim council acted in another. Shared interests often mattered more than faith, and joint action across religious lines was common when property, taxation, or local rights were at stake. One of the most visible institutional roles of the Muslim Council was the management of communal property. Although Islamic tradition placed limited emphasis on corporate ownership, certain assets were treated as belonging to the community. Muslim councils actively defended the sacred character of burial grounds, negotiated permission for new cemeteries, and agreed to abandon older sites when required. They also contested unlawful seizures of communal land, sometimes successfully forcing restitution. These cases show that the council functioned as a guardian of collective memory, religious space, and material resources. Another important responsibility involved the property of Muslims who died without heirs. Preserving such estates was a key principle of Islamic law, and many councils were granted the right to claim these assets, usually sharing the proceeds with the royal treasury. Despite this, officials and lords sometimes attempted to appropriate such property outright, leading to disputes in which royal intervention was again required. In certain cases, even attempts at fraud were uncovered and punished, when false heirs were presented to block royal claims. In addition to taxes, Muslim councils were subject to other obligations imposed by the crown. These included demands for skilled labour, the production of tools or weapons, and participation in construction projects. Muslim craftsmen were periodically summoned for royal works, just as Christian artisans were. Sometimes individuals were named directly. At other times, the order was addressed to the council as a whole, leaving internal organisation and distribution of labour to its leaders. Military service obligations also expanded over time. While early agreements limited such duties, by the late 13th century many Muslim communities were expected to contribute in this sphere as well, unless they had secured specific exemptions. These evolving demands further reinforced the need for structured leadership and internal coordination. When we look closely at how Muslim communities were run after the conquest, their internal structure becomes visible through the people who held office. We catch them in appointment notices, in routine acts, and most clearly in arguments over who had the right to judge, tax, or command. Early surrender agreements allowed Muslim towns to preserve something that resembled their older administration, but over time that arrangement changed. As Christian rulers reorganized territory and governance in their own way, Muslim communities were gradually pulled into new boundaries, new chains of authority, and new administrative habits. This did not require a single grand plan to rewrite Muslim practice. It happened through daily contact with the institutions of the victors and through the practical need to function inside the new political map. The result was an administration that became more hybrid and more uneven, shaped by local adaptation rather than a single uniform model. Across the region, there was no standard blueprint. Larger communities usually had a principal figure recognised by the crown or by a local lord, and the same person might be described with different titles depending on the document, the place, or the writer's habits. Under Christian rule, these labels stopped matching their older meanings in a strict sense. They were used broadly for the leading representative of the community, often the person expected to handle disputes, communicate with authorities, and stand as the public face of Muslim justice. Over time, offices also began to behave less like traditional roles and more like licensed privileges. Holding a post increasingly meant holding the right to perform certain functions and to collect the fees attached to them. Those rights could be costly, and the price of entry naturally favoured the wealthy and the well-connected. It also encouraged consolidation. One person might gather multiple posts at once, building a monopoly over the community's key administrative streams. That concentration of power invited abuse, blurred accountability, and sometimes placed authority in hands that the community did not respect on religious or moral grounds. This shift had deeper consequences because, in Islamic social life, religious authority and administrative authority were not easily separated. A leader's legitimacy depended on learning, reputation, and public trust, not merely on approval from an outside ruler. When an official was seen as chosen for money, influence, or convenience rather than knowledge and integrity, his authority could be challenged in practice even if it was upheld on paper. In divided societies, when the dominant power tries to regulate a minority through official channels, the minority often answers by building unofficial channels of its own. That pattern likely emerged here as well. The written record only hints at it, but those hints are suggestive. Communities sometimes bypassed their appointed judges, turning instead to respected local figures who had no formal stamp of approval. Official complaints about jurisdiction being violated may reflect that invisible struggle between licensed authority and popular authority. We see moments where a removed official still seemed to command loyalty, while a replacement faced resistance and accusations of disobedience because people carried their cases elsewhere. In the earliest period after conquest, many Muslim communities still retained a tradition of consent in choosing leadership, at least in part. Some agreements were addressed to the whole community, and others included a role for prominent local figures in government. In a few places, rulers even framed appointments as being made with community approval, as if older ideas of communal assent still mattered. But by the late 13th century, these practices had weakened across much of the region. What survived most clearly were elected representatives who acted as the community's voice in dealings with the crown. They were chosen by local Muslims and served as a bridge between the ruler and the ruled. In some towns, safeguards were introduced to keep the main royal-approved official from controlling these elections, and the elected representatives were made to swear loyalty to the king's deputy to confirm the process. Their duties could be practical and heavy, overseeing tax collection, guaranteeing deliveries demanded by the crown, acting as advocates in disputes, and even standing surety for prisoners. Yet even this limited space for popular selection could be bought, sold, revoked, and restored depending on royal politics and local pressure, revealing how fragile communal autonomy had become. As Christian institutions became more deeply involved in Muslim life, royal officials took on a larger role inside Muslim administration. This was clearest in taxation, where collection was often handled by agents who answered directly to the court and were not part of the Muslim community. But Christian oversight reached beyond finance. In some areas, posts that sounded like Muslim offices were increasingly held by Christians, except in a few major centres where Muslims retained them and Christian supervision operated through broader municipal officials. Many of the Christians in these roles were not neutral professionals. They were often nobles, soldiers, or local power holders with private interests, and those interests could clash with their official duties. When communities tried to rely on royal protections, they sometimes discovered that the very people tasked with enforcing those protections were the ones encroaching on their rights. The presence of Christians in positions linked to Muslim justice has led some observers to imagine Christians acting as Islamic judges. The reality was usually more indirect. A Christian officer might supervise, enforce, or execute decisions made by Muslim judges, functioning as the coercive arm rather than the legal mind. Still, there were exceptions. When cases touched Christian jurisdiction, when violence erupted in sensitive spaces, or when Islamic courts failed to satisfy powerful parties, Christian judges sometimes stepped in. Appeals also offered a pathway for cases to move into Christian hands. This produced a shifting legal landscape where formal principles existed, but outcomes could depend on local privileges, the determination of officials, the influence of litigants, and the political aims of the crown. That uncertainty encouraged predatory behaviour. Christian officials sometimes attempted to seize jurisdiction over Muslim litigants for profit, since judicial work could generate income through fines and fees. We repeatedly see royal interventions rebuking officials who tried to pull Muslims into Christian courts, or who tried to siphon off revenues attached to Muslim offices. Market officials attempted to extend control over Muslim traders. Deputies claimed salaries that belonged to Muslim functionaries. Some officials simply ignored royal orders and continued their abuses for months. When the Islamic system was threatened in this way, Muslim communities often reacted with striking unity, setting aside internal disputes to defend what they saw as a shared right. Even people who distrusted their own officials might still prefer them to a Christian court, especially when the alternative carried the fear of bias or heavier penalties. Despite their disadvantages, Muslims did have routes of complaint and appeal. Communities sometimes succeeded in having abusive officials summoned, investigated, suspended, or forced to restore seized property. They could act alone or alongside Christian neighbours when interests aligned. Yet royal authority had limits. Some officials defied orders openly, betting that distance, local influence, or political distraction would protect them. And not every conflict can be reduced to religious hostility. Economic rivalry, municipal protectionism, and power struggles between Christian lords could all produce abuses in which Muslims became convenient leverage. Hostage-taking, collective pressure, and retaliatory seizures show how easily innocent Muslim subjects could be used as bargaining tools in disputes among Christian powers. Within this environment, Islamic justice remained central to Muslim identity and was widely promised in early agreements. The scarcity of Muslim-only civil cases in royal records suggests that Much of the time, internal disputes were handled within the community without drawing in the crown. The real friction often appeared in disputes across faith lines and in appeals. In theory, many legal traditions recognized that a defendant should be judged according to his own law. In practice, that principle was uneven. Sometimes Muslims were pulled into Christian courts. Sometimes Christians or Jews found themselves before Muslim judges. Sometimes ecclesiastical tribunals claimed authority. The path a case followed could be shaped by local custom, by power, and by the strategic choices of the parties. There were even places where Islamic jurisdiction gained a kind of precedence in mixed disputes, so that non-Muslims suing Muslims had to appear before the Muslim judge within a certain territory. Yet privileges could be reversed by royal favour, granting exemptions that removed certain groups from Muslim jurisdiction. Even then, the older expectations did not always vanish. Individuals continued to petition for their cases to be heard by the judge of their own community, and royal figures sometimes reaffirmed Muslim jurisdiction against interference. What emerges is not a clean division between two legal worlds, but a negotiated, contested frontier inside the law itself, where identity, authority, and profit constantly reshaped the boundaries of justice.